Hey everybody, Professor Snart checking in as we get right down to the end of our course, and I'm just going to check into our due dates to see where we're at. It's Tuesday morning when I'm recording this, so we are looking at Unit 13, which was the Virginia Woolf that we've just gotten through. Was due on Monday. Joyce is coming up due Wednesday, so again, one of those quick turnarounds. Derek Walcott, which is sort of the final author that we cover in Unit 15, and then Unit 16, the final essay, is due the final, the official final day of the course, which is Sunday, July 1st. But I would imagine that a number of people would get that essay done and submitted before, that late in the course. So let me just talk a little bit about sort of where we're at in the late modernist period, still looking at those major figures, people like Eliot, Woolf, and Joyce, major players in the modernist movement. And then the Joyce unit is interesting because it provides a nice sort of culmination to this period that we're looking at in terms of us looking at Joyce specifically, but also then considering Joyce, Eliot, and Woolf in terms of maybe there's similarities as modernists, at least in the general sense of trying to push boundaries, of doing things in new ways, of invoking tradition but also reworking it. And then really maybe the surprising thing, I guess, in terms of the Joyce unit is that since we're looking at all three authors together, is that within this umbrella of modernism, we see maybe a lot of differences among those authors, a little bit like we'd seen when we first got into the modernist period, looking at how modernism plays itself out in so many different artistic venues, whether it's dance, music, architecture. So within this kind of general idea of making things new, of breaking with tradition, of reconfiguring tradition in some ways, there's lots of variation. So it's one of those sort of the same but different of scenarios. So Unit 14 lets us really think about modernism in a kind of overarching way, although again, as people have been doing a really good job of already, be sure that your discussion board posts contain lots of specifics relative to the readings that we're actually looking at. The ideas that we're thinking about are kind of grand and overarching, but those are always supported with specifics from the text. So Unit 15 then, on Derek Walcott, who is a very famous poet, contemporary poet, still alive. He was born in the Caribbean island of St. Lucia, has lived in America, but still spends time here, has lived, worked as a visiting professor in a number of places in Europe. And so we sort of have this global component. But you'll notice that unlike someone like Eliot, although even that's a little complicated, but Eliot, Woolf, Joyce, sort of prototypical British writers, Walcott really challenges our notion here at the end of our course of exactly what quote-unquote British literature or English literature can even be. And in fact, if you were to glance through our textbook, what you would see is very traditional kind of official British writers up until the very contemporary period, where because of the imperial or the British Empire that really flourished at the High Victorian period, you have the idea of being British not just limited to the small island nation of England and its sort of local countries there, but really a global presence. The sun never sets on the British Empire. That means for us studying British literature, after a certain point, you have places around the globe, including African writers, Canadian writers, the Caribbean writers like Derek Walcott, who can all claim, whether they would want to or not, some connection to the British literary tradition, whether it's a direct British occupation of that place at some point, of authors being born at a time when a particular country was, whether it's in South Africa or the Caribbean, it was British, nominally at least, at that point. So sort of literal, they're British writers, at least as far as that goes. But like Derek Walcott, and he makes this clear really throughout his work, he still has an allegiance to the British literary tradition. And since his cultural roots and his literary roots are to some degree British, that he fits within this idea of British literature. But the end of our course is just this perfect time to sort of challenge these ideas of what it even means to say that someone is a British writer or African or Caribbean, or how can you be a mix of these things together? And this is precisely what Walcott has to address throughout his work, and he does so in these really interesting ways where he admits that he is drawn to the British literary tradition but obviously despises its imperial history. So how do you reconcile those two? Can you reconcile them? Do you need to reconcile them? And that question is sort of fundamental to us, because it's the question of, if you don't have a sort of pure history to draw from, are you somehow damaged or broken, and thus in need of repair? So this whole notion of having to reconcile these differences, and Walcott never exactly settling on an answer to these kinds of questions, is sort of an answer in itself, actually. It's a challenge to the very notion that one has to reconcile difference, or that one has to fix that which is quote-unquote broken, because maybe it was never broken in the first place. And then the other nice thing about concluding with Walcott is that he's famous for, among other works, a work called Omerus, which we have very small sections of in our textbook, but which is an epic work. I actually should have looked for it before I started talking here. I'm not sure if I have the book close by. I'll find it as soon as I hit pause, I'm sure. No, maybe not. But anyway, it's a book-length epic. It's an epic poem. Its scope is epic. It has a massive cast of characters. It ranges through time periods from contemporary to 16th, 17th century. Again, its locations are European, African, Caribbean, America. It's all over the place. And so we have, at the end of our course, an epic poet from a small island nation, which recalls actually nicely where we started with Milton. Again, a quintessential sort of British author now, but an epic poet from, at the time, what was just a small island nation. It hadn't, England hadn't really taken on the sort of global supremacy that it would, certainly in the Victorian period. It was really kind of secondary to continental, European centers of military and really intellectual power. So Milton is writing sort of against that, and also very consciously crafting basically the first epic in his native language, English, rather than writing in Latin, which would have been sort of the default language for a poem like that at the time. And so Milton was really encountering, even though we don't think of it that way because he is so clearly like a British author and such a massive figure now, he was encountering or challenging or dealing with some of the very same issues that Walcott himself is dealing with. And so they provide this very nice sort of bookends to our course. So Walcott is, as with the authors we've covered, he's fascinating in his own right, but he also provides this great sort of capstone in terms of a lineage or a heritage of authors who are writing in response to one another, in response to the same kinds of ideas, who are writing to pick up and agree with, to challenge and dismantle certain ideas. So we see this real kind of intellectual continuum that is not fulfilled in Walcott. It's not like he's the end of the situation, but he certainly carries that through, and so we can see a nice kind of unity to the authors within our course, bookended by these epics on either side of it. Again, unfortunately we don't, or maybe fortunately, depending on your perspective, we don't get a lot of the actual epic that Walcott wrote in our textbook. We just get a very small section. But you'll notice that even that section is fundamentally about healing wounds, both literal in the case of the poem, but it takes on this greater metaphorical implication in terms of a whole culture, this Caribbean culture of healing the wounds of its colonial past, being quite literally owned by any number of European powers, French, Spanish, Dutch, English, throughout its history, and someone like Walcott having to come to terms with that complex heritage, some of which he loves and some of which he hates, and how do you deal with that? Okay, so really quickly then I'm going to jump into our final unit, which is sort of a reflection essay here, having you look back and think about, again, in an overarching way, some of the material that we've covered. So to provide some sense of unity, you're going to choose a theme. And again, this could be fairly general. I provided some examples here, but you're more than welcome. In fact, I would encourage you to maybe choose something that was interesting to you now that you reflect on the readings that we've done, a particular theme that emerged over and over again, even if authors didn't address it in the same way necessarily. Was it something that people sort of continually return to as one of these problems that literature wants to address? And then choose at least 3 works from throughout our course, not just bunched into one little section, so I'm looking for that diversity. And then quoting directly from those works, how do those authors address that particular theme? So that's pretty standard as far as the kind of essay that we've been writing so far. The other element that I'm looking for you to add here is more of the personal reflection on how your own thinking about that theme has changed based on the readings that you've done. In other words, what have you learned, not just from the course, but really from what's important, the stuff that we've been reading, in some cases, the triumphs of the literary tradition that we have and that we've had access to through this course. How have they affected you? That's really maybe the most important part of where we want to conclude is, not just what fact have you learned, but what way has your thinking changed based on the readings that we've done and the authors that we've encountered. How has this been meaningful other than just, I've done the work and I read a bunch of stuff. So what? That's the question we're looking to answer here. So the style, for the most part, is similar to discussion board essays that we've worked on, relatively formal. Clearly, you're writing in the I voice at some point because you're talking about your own experience. And this essay is likely to be a little bit longer just because you have a little bit more to cover here, but it's not like all of a sudden you're trying to deal with, every reading that we've done, every idea we've covered, every ancillary video we've watched or something like that. So the scope is a little bit bigger, but it's not like you're trying to capture everything in one essay. So don't bite off more than you can chew, in other words. Okay, so we are getting right down to the end of our course here, just a few more days left. Be sure that you do the response portion for all of the units as well. Don't forget that aspect of what we have going on. And then by all means, be in touch with me with any last questions or concerns. If you have an idea for that final essay, you want to run it by me, that's great. Email me, I'll get back to you probably within hours, if not a day at most. So just stay on track for a few more days, and then we're almost done with just about everything there is to know about Brit Lit. All right.